Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Gentleman's Magazine from April 1800. And this article is entitled Retrospect of the 18th Century, Essay 3. So we have read Essay 1 and 2, so I'm going to make this a bit bigger so I can actually read it. And I'm interested to see what happens next because they've been going over very accurately, I might add, the history of England from... They did a quick retrospective of the 17th century and then moved on to the 18th century, which began with the reign of William and Mary, and then moved on to Queen Anne. So let's find out what happens next. Yeah? So, Retrospect of the 18th Century, Essay 3. Queen Anne, at her first elevation to the throne, enjoyed the smiles of all parties. But the bill for forming an union of the two kingdoms of England and Scotland raised a strong opposition in the British Parliament, and still more violent one being formed in that of Scotland. The measure was laid aside at that time. Interesting. So she tried to unite England and Scotland and failed because of the huge opposition on both sides. So it was more something she wanted and not something the people wanted, yeah? War being declared on the 4th of May, 1702, the Earl of Marlborough, in the beginning of July, repaired to the Confederate Army at Nimeguen. I don't know where that is. We'll have to look it up later. And having taken command, advanced toward the enemy. But as they scrupulously avoided an engagement, he laid siege to Venlo. Venlo, I happen to know where that is. That's in the Netherlands. And I have been there before. That's how I know how to pronounce it as well, by the way. It's not Venlo, it's Venlo. Yeah? This is Dutch. Which capitulated on September 25th, as did also Roermond, which is, by the way, is misspelled, but I know where that is too, after an obstinate defense. The French having abandoned Liège, it's Liège, isn't it? And it was taken possession of by the Allies, and the citadel soon after surrendered. Thus successful was the Earl in his first campaign, and thereby laid the foundation for those hopes which the future conduct fully realized. Why are they talking so much about the Earl of Marlborough? I mean, he must have been a big player in history. We'll have to look him up later, too. By the way, this is what I like to do. I like to read through the entire article first and then look it up later. We'll fact check it, but at the moment I just want to read what they have to say. The most brilliant action performed this year by the Navy was the taking of Vigo by Sir George Rooke, in which Vice Admiral Hobson particularly signalized himself by... Signalized? That's what it says. By breaking the boom which was thrown across the harbor. I don't know what that means. Like, a boom. Does that mean like a barricade? A French squadron of, is it 30 or 80? I can't quite read that number. 30 men of war and 22 Spanish galleons were either taken or destroyed. The fortifications dismantled and the fleet returned in safety to England with plunder to the value of $1 million and upwards. Wow. So they're talking about the movements of the Navy, yes? In the West Indies, Admiral Benbow, with the British fleet, coming to an action with the French under Ducasse, was deserted by most of his captains. After sustaining the engagement for several days, most of the time unsupported by any of the ships under his command, he was severely wounded and obliged to return to Jamaica, where he soon after died. 2 of his captains, Kirby and Wade, were condemned by a court-martial to be shot, and this sentence was put in execution on their arrival at Plymouth. I am certain these events took, made headline news at the time. Today, it's absolutely not something we know about. Nobody cares, It really kind of puts into perspective what's in the news today and, what won't be in the news tomorrow, A new parliament having been elected is assembled in October, and though it in general met the wishes of the Queen, the factions became so acrimonious to each other as even to create violent disputes between the two houses. Wow. These disputes began to manifest themselves in the debates and conferences on the bill against occasional conformity, which after a severe struggle was lost by the Commons refusing to agree to the amendments made by the Lords. Upon the upon the consideration of the public accompts, these disputes grew to absolute discord, for in the mismanagement of the money appropriated for the service of the nation, some of the members of both houses were said to be deeply implicated. That's not good. And as all sides despaired of an accommodation, Her Majesty prorogued the Parliament on the 27th of February following. In the Houses of Convocation, no greater degree of coincidence was found to submit than in those of the Parliament. Indeed, dissensions were so deeply sown by all parties that, had there not been a foreign inveterate enemy to have engaged the intention of the nation, it is probable they would have ended worse than in those cabals which greatly perplexed, and in some degree thwarted the designs of the executive government. Interesting. They're claiming that the only reason the government was even reasonably united was because they were at war. And saying if they hadn't been, it probably would have torn them apart. That's pretty strong words, I'm not going to lie. The Earl of Marlborough, being returned, received the thanks of both Houses of Parliament, was created a duke, and had a pension of £5,000 a year settled on him for life. That's pretty high, though. I mean, at that time, yeah. The Parliament of Scotland being met in 1703, a session the most violent possible was commenced, in which the Duke of Queensberry had to combat with all the jarring interests of which it was composed, and toward the close of it, when the Earl of Marchmont produced the bill to settle the succession in the House of Hanover, all on the mentioning of the Princess Sophia, it burst into a flame, and the most serious altercations ensued, so that the Duke was under the necessity of proroguing the Parliament to the 12th of October. Interesting. Ireland also during this time was very unquiet. That's a great word, isn't it? Unquiet. But the Duke of Ormond, being appointed Lord Lieutenant, was cordially received by the people in general, and the Commons cheerfully voted the necessary supplies, etc. Though before the session was ended, he incurred their greatest displeasure by suddenly adjourning the Parliament, while some strong measures against the Papists were depending. But that's in Ireland. Like, why would they be voting against the Catholics? Okay, I have noted also that in British history, particularly at this time, there was a very, very strong prejudice against Catholics. And any, people who were just, considering being Catholic, they called it popery or papists, yeah? So, yeah, because they follow the Pope. I don't know, it's weird. I have been thus particular in noticing the transactions of the first Parliament of Queen Anne, etc., because they were principally in the foundation on which the happy succession of the Hanover line was secured. And though there were many other momentous occurrences, civil and military, which are worthy of remark, yet the limits to which these essays should be confined but forbid my particularizing all, and my enlarging on any of them. And therefore I shall now pass on briefly to notice some of the greatest events which this pregnant reign hath favoured us with. Okay, so some of the highlights of the reign of Queen Anne, yeah? In the campaign of 1703, the Duke of Marlborough was equally successful as the towns of Bonn, High, and Limburg were taken, and the French army obliged to act on the defensive, and retreated continually as he advanced. But in that of 1704, his abilities shone with redoubled splendor, particularly on Blenheim, where the French army was totally defeated by the Confederates, with the loss of 10,000 killed and 13,000 made prisoners, their cannon, camp, equipage, etc., all taken. The consequences of this brilliant victory were the rescuing of the House of Austria from ruin, and the subjection of Augsburg, Ulm, Landau, etc. By the greatest acquisition of this year, indeed of the whole war, was the taking of Gibraltar by Sir George Rooke, who, in one day, without an army, subdued the fortress, which since then has withstood the united efforts of France and Spain during an unparalleled siege of 7 years. That is quite impressive. Yeah, I tip my hat. All right. In most of the succeeding campaigns to 1711, the Duke was blessed with continued success, won many battles, among which should be remembered that of Ramillies, wherein the enemy sustained a complete defeat, reduced most of their fortified places in the Netherlands, and finished the career of his military glory by the taking of Bouchain, which, though fortified by every advantage of nature and art, was by the consummate skill and intrepidity of his grace obliged to surrender in 20 days from the opening of the trenches, and the garrison made prisoners of war. Though this was the last, it was certainly one of the bloodiest enterprises in which the Duke was engaged, for the place was not only deemed impregnable, but he had to attempt it in the preference of the superior army, commanded by Marshal de Villars, whose efforts to raise the siege were rendered ineffectual by the prudence and activity of the Duke. Thus, for 10 campaigns was the Duke of Marlborough successful, perhaps in a greater degree than any other general ever was who was so actively engaged. He never sustained a defeat, never was obliged to raise a siege. His vigilance and prudence were such that he never was surprised by the enemy, nor had any of his out-parties cut off. Out-parties? I'm not quite sure what that means. Okay. 10 times he had received the thanks of both Houses of Parliament, and, arrived at the zenith of military glory, his name was echoed throughout the land, with all that enthusiasm and praise which characterizes the British nation in the behalf of its heroes. But when the Tory interest had gained the ascendancy in the cabinet and the Parliament, he, that had almost been idolized by the lovers of their country, was, in a moment, dashed from the pinnacle of fame into the abyss of contempt, derision, and obloquy. How fleeting is world's honor, and how unstable all things here below. Interesting. I wonder why. After the most violent opposition in the parliaments of England and Scotland, particularly in that of the latter, the union of the two kingdoms was accomplished in 1707. And probably no measure of equal importance was ever carried by the determined perseverance of a court in direct contrariety to the opinion, not only of the majority, but nearly of the whole of any nation. Oh gosh, they were united basically against their own will. But great as the prejudices of the people then were against the measure, time hath manifested that it was devised in wisdom, and that its accomplishment hath been conducive to the prosperity and tranquillity of the United Kingdoms. Interesting. You really think so? I'm not so sure, but During this period, i.e. from 1703 to 1707, not only the nation was agitated with violent parties, but the House of Parliament were also in a continual ferment from them. Though they cheerfully voted the supplies, and were loyal in their address to Her Majesty, yet every other measure induced by either party was strenuously opposed by the other. But towards the close of the session in 1707, the Tories began to gain strength, particularly among the people at large, and in 1708, Mrs. Marsham, having supplanted the Duchess of Marlborough in the Queen's friendship, Her Majesty more fully countenanced their measures, and on April 15th the Parliament was dissolved. Wow. From the commencement of the Parliament, which assembled on the 18th of November, to the conclusion of the treaty for peace at Utrecht, which was signed April 11, 1713, the Tories continued to gain ground, for in September 1710 the Whig ministry was disgraced. The Parliament was dissolved, and a new one being met on the 25th of November, it was found that the Tory interest had obtained the complete ascendancy, so that all the measures which had been adopted or executed by the Whigs was condemned as dishonorable to the nation, destructive to her prosperity, and devised solely for the aggrandizement or advantage of the heads of that party. The people joining heartily in these clamors, the peace was accelerated, that an end might be put to a war, which, though attended with unparalleled successes, was now considered by many an insupportable, and that They only were the true friends of their country who strove to bring it to a speedy termination. T. Mott FSM. Interesting. Wow, there's a lot of back and forth, wasn't there? Like at the beginning of the 18th century. That's crazy. Here, let's see if we can find out more. So this is the Wikipedia page. It's called Early Modern Britain. 18th century. Okay, I got it. So the 18th century was characterized by numerous major wars, especially with France and the growth and collapse of the First British Empire with the origins of the Second British Empire, and with steady economic and social growth at home. Peace between England and the Netherlands in 1688 meant that the two countries entered the 9 Years' War as allies, but the conflict, waged in Europe and overseas between France, Spain, and the Anglo-Dutch alliance, left the English a stronger colonial power than the Dutch, who were forced to devote a larger proportion of their military budget on the costly land war in Europe. The 18th century would see England, after 1707 Great Britain, rise to be the world's dominant colonial power, and France becoming its main rival on the imperial stage. In 1701, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands sided with the Holy Roman Empire against Spain, France, and the War of the Spanish Succession. The conflict, which France and Spain were to lose, lasted until 1714. The British Empire was territorially enlarged, from France gaining Newfoundland and Acadia, and from Spain, Gibraltar and Minorca. Gibraltar, which is still a British overseas territory to this day, became a critical naval base and allowed Britain to control the Atlantic entry and exit point to the Mediterranean. All right, Treaty of Union. I think this is also relevant. Yes. The United Kingdom of Great Britain was born on May 1st, 1707, shortly after the Parliaments of Scotland and England had ratified the Treaty of Union of 1706, by each approving Acts of Union combining the two parliaments and the two royal titles. Deeper political integration had been a key policy of Queen Anne. Under the aegis of the Queen and her advisors, a Treaty of Union was drawn up, and negotiations between England and Scotland began in earnest in 1706. Scottish proponents of union believed that failure to accede to the bill would result in the imposition of union under less favorable terms, and months of fierce debate in both capital cities and throughout both kingdoms followed. In Scotland, the debate on occasion dissolved into civil disorder, most notably by the notorious Edinburgh mob. The prospect of a union of the kingdoms was deeply unpopular among the Scottish population at large, and talk of an uprising was widespread. However, Scotland could not long continue. Following the financially disastrous Darien scheme, the near-bankrupt Parliament of Scotland reluctantly accepted the proposals. Supposed financial payoffs to Scottish parliamentarians were later referred to by Robert Burns when he wrote, We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues as in a nation. Recent historians, however, have emphasized the legitimacy of the vote. The Acts of Union took effect in 1707, uniting the separate parliaments and crowns of England and Scotland and forming a single Kingdom of Great Britain. Queen Anne, already queen in both England and Scotland, became formally the first occupant of the unified British throne, with Scotland sending 45 members to join all existing members from the Parliament of England in the new House of Commons of Great Britain, as well as 16 representative peers to join all existing peers from the Parliament of England in the new House of Lords. Wow. So they did mention that it was basically against their will, yeah? Jacobite Rising. I don't think we've gotten to that point yet. I feel like these articles go very slowly because the first one was so fast. It was just a very quick overview of the 17th century. But then they're going very slowly through the 18th, like very slowly. They're taking like 5 to 7 years at a time, which is fine, but I'm wondering how many are in this series now. What have I gotten myself into? But I still find it very interesting, and I didn't realize that England and Scotland had united basically against the people's will. It was Parliament who did it, and they felt pressured to do it, or they would be forced to. So I don't think that that's a legitimate vote. I feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Which way are you going to choose? Because they're both suck, you know? Like, it's not really like a happy choice here. Anyway, but I did learn tons today, once again. I was also interested because some of the place names they were mentioning are in Germany, but they didn't specifically mention that they were at war with Germany. I'm wondering if, because I don't believe Germany was a united country yet, so I think that they weren't, technically, that they were at war with like one of the little like factions of that happen to be in Germany now, but weren't at the time. So just an idea, but I don't know, I was interested in a lot of those people as well. So just for fun, let's look up a couple of the people. I want to look up the Earl of Marlborough. Okay, Earl of Marlborough is a title that has been created twice, both times in the Peerage of England. In the first time in 1626 in favor of James Lee and first Baron Lee, and the second in 1689 for John Churchill, first Baron Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough. That sounds like him, yeah? So I'm thinking it's John Churchill we're talking about. So I'm going to go to his page. Marriage to Sarah Jennings and her relationship with Anne ensured Marlborough's rise first to the Captain Generalcy of British forces and then to dukedom as de facto leader of the Allied forces in the Low Countries, that's the Netherlands. His victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenaarde, and Malplaquet ensured his place in history as one of Europe's great generals. His wife's stormy relationship with the Queen and her subsequent dismissal from court was central to his own fall, incurring Anne's disfavor and caught between the Tory and Whig factions. Marlborough was forced from office and went into self-imposed exile. He returned to favor with the accession of George I to the British throne in 1714, but a stroke in 1716 ended his career. Okay, so that is what they mentioned. They didn't quite mention all these places, but most of them, Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenaarde. And they also mentioned that he lost favor. Interesting that it was because the Queen didn't like his wife. Like, I don't like you, go away. All right, let's take a look. Were there any other people I wanted to look up? Okay, I'm also going to look up Sir George Rooke, since he was supposedly the one who got Gibraltar, yeah? Royal Navy Admiral, that sounds right. Oh, he died in 1709. Was an English naval officer. As a junior officer, he saw action at the Battle of Solbay, and again at the Battle of Schoonveld during the Third Anglo-Dutch War. As a captain, he conveyed Prince William of Orange to England and took part in the Battle of Bantry Bay during the Williamite War in Ireland. Okay, so he was already well known, yeah? Okay, here we go. Rooke commanded the unsuccessful Allied expedition against Cadiz, but on the passage home he destroyed the Spanish treasure fleet at the Battle of Vigo Bay in the opening stages of the War of the Spanish Succession. He also commanded the Allied naval forces at the capture of Gibraltar and attacked the French fleet at the Battle of Malaga. Malaga? Yeah, I think it's Malaga. I was really interested in the Gibraltar part here. Okay, Rooke safely delivered Archduke Charles of Austria, the claimant to the Spanish throne, to Windsor Castle in December 1703, flying his flag in the second-rate HMS Royal Catherine. He commanded the Allied naval forces who arrived in Gibraltar in August 1704 after a bombardment by 22 ships directed by Admiral George Byng. A landing party disembarked, hoisted the Union flag, and captured Gibraltar. Rooke also attacked the French fleet at the Battle of Malaga later that month. Interesting. So, like, what they said about it being taken, like, basically overnight also sounds legit, yeah? They took it, raised the flag, and nobody else was able to take it since then. But then again, let's be honest, the British Navy is one of the strongest in the world, so it's not that surprising that they were able to defeat the other ones around. So yeah. Anyway, I found that very fascinating. I hope you did too. So we are now up to 1714, which was the year Queen Anne died. Yes? So I believe we will start there in the next selection. I hope you're enjoying these as much as I am. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.